Robert Frater, thank you very much for meeting us.
Thank you. I liked bigger women because I was always on the small side, and so I wanted to marry a woman who was large so my children wouldn't grow up like me, being small and picked on. So no, she didn't meet the physical attributes of what I was looking for in a wife, but I felt like, hey, this must be the woman that God wanted me to marry.
Are you afraid sometimes what's coming at you?
Oh no, not at all. I'm not afraid of death.
After nearly 3 decades on death row, Robert Allen Frater was led into the execution chamber on January 10, 2023. He was 65 years old, a former police officer, a father of 3. But to his children, he was the reason they grew up without a mother. Because in 1994, Robert orchestrated the murder of his estranged wife, Farah, a woman who had finally broken free from his demands, his control, and his dark obsessions. Their marriage had unraveled under the weight of his disturbing sexual fantasies. Farah told the court that Robert pressured her into wife-swapping and degrading acts she refused to accept. For her, divorce was the only escape. For Robert, it was unforgivable. He didn't shoot Farah himself. Instead, he pulled others into his twisted plan, a middleman named Joseph Pristosh and an 18-year-old triggerman, Howard Guidry. On a November night, as Farah pulled her car into the garage, 3 gunshots ended her life. 3 children were left motherless, and the suburban image of Robert Frater, the clean-cut ex-cop, the neighborhood dad, collapsed forever. As the straps tightened across his arms inside Huntsville's death chamber, the weight of those choices hung heavy in the room. When asked if he had any last words, Frater's answer was simple: no. No apologies, no explanations, just silence. At 7:49 p.m., Robert Frater was pronounced dead. His final meal was ordinary, a hamburger, fries, and dessert. But nothing about the crime that put him here was ordinary. Because this wasn't just the story of a man who wanted his wife gone. It was the story of a husband who turned his darkest sexual fantasies into fuel for murder. So who was Robert Frater? A manipulator who valued control above life itself? A coward who could not let his wife walk away? Or if death row inmates, we need to go back. Back to the bitter divorce hearings. Back to the shocking testimony of a wife fighting for her dignity. And then forward to a November night in 1994 when Farah Frater stepped out of her car and never came back inside alive. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Robert Allen Frater was born on February 22, 1957, into a middle-class family in Missouri City, Texas. His father worked in law enforcement, establishing a family tradition of authority and control that would profoundly influence Robert's worldview. From an early age, Robert learned that a badge and uniform commanded respect, a lesson he would later exploit in the most devastating ways. As a child, Robert displayed an unusual need for attention and control. Teachers noted his tendency to dominate classroom discussions and his anger when other students received praise. He learned early that his physical presence and natural charisma could influence others, skills he practiced and refined throughout his youth. During his teenage years, Robert's manipulative tendencies became more pronounced. He dated multiple girls simultaneously, lying effortlessly to maintain these relationships while enjoying the sense of power that came from deceiving people who trusted him. Friends who discovered his deceptions were either charmed back into his circle or systematically excluded from his social group. Robert's high school years were marked by his obsession with physical fitness and his growing belief that strength equaled dominance. He spent countless hours lifting weights and studying bodybuilding magazines, not just for health, but because he understood that an imposing physical presence gave him advantages over others. His muscular build became part of his identity and his primary tool for intimidation. After graduation, Robert's career path seemed inevitable given his family background and personal psychology. He joined the Missouri City Public Safety Department in the late 1970s, entering a profession that perfectly suited his need for authority and control. The cross-training as both police officer and firefighter appealed to his ego. He could present himself as a versatile hero while carrying weapons and making life-or-death decisions. The badge and gun that came with Robert's job transformed him from a manipulative young man into something far more dangerous. He now had legal authority to detain, question, and even use force against citizens. More importantly, his profession gave him automatic credibility with judges, juries, and the general public, who assumed that police officers were inherently trustworthy. Robert's colleagues quickly learned to recognize his problematic behaviors, though few understood their significance at the time. He bragged constantly about his sexual conquests, describing women in derogatory terms and expressing views about male dominance that made listeners uncomfortable. His locker room conversations revealed a man who saw relationships as contests to be won rather than partnerships to be cherished. The power dynamics that Robert enjoyed at work extended into his off-duty activities. He frequented Houston's topless bars and strip clubs, using his badge and gun to impress dancers and demand special treatment. Club employees learned to tolerate his behavior because challenging a police officer could bring unwanted scrutiny to their businesses. Robert's gym routine became almost obsessive during his 20s. He worked out for hours every day, not just to maintain his physique, but because gyms provided him with audiences of men who admired strength and dominance. The warning signs of Robert's dangerous psychology were evident to anyone who spent significant time with him. He showed no genuine empathy for others, viewing every interaction as an opportunity to gain advantage or assert dominance. His relationships with women were characterized by rapid escalation, followed by increasingly controlling behavior as he tested their willingness to submit to his demands. Robert's worldview was fundamentally predatory. He divided people into categories, those who could be used and those who might threaten him. Women were potential conquests to be charmed, controlled, and ultimately discarded when they no longer served his purposes. Men were either potential allies who shared his views or competitors to be neutralized through intimidation or manipulation. By his late 20s, Robert had perfected the dual persona that would define his adult life. To the outside world, he was a dedicated public safety officer who protected the community and maintained order. Behind closed doors, he was a calculating manipulator who used his authority and charm to exploit vulnerable people for his own gratification. The missing element in Robert's life was a permanent victim, someone who would provide him with the complete control he craved while maintaining the respectable image he needed for his career. He required a woman who was isolated enough to be manipulated, trusting enough to be deceived, and vulnerable enough to be completely dominated. His search for this perfect target would soon lead him to an airport where a young woman from England was just beginning her American adventure, unaware that her trusting nature and cultural isolation made her exactly what a predator like Robert Fratta had been looking for. Farah Fahmida, later known as Farah Fratta, was that victim. Farah Fahmida Care entered the world on August 5, 1961, at St. Luke's Hospital in Guildford, Surrey, England. Born to Lex and Betty Baker, she was described by her parents as their little full-of-life baby, a characterization that would define her throughout her short but impactful existence. Growing up in England's post-war recovery period, Farah experienced the kind of stable, loving childhood that would later make her vulnerable to those who didn't share her optimistic view of human nature. Her parents, who had emigrated from Pakistan to England, seeking better opportunities, instilled in their daughter the values of hard work, family loyalty, and treating others with kindness. Farah attended Newman High School in Croydon, South London, where she was known as a popular student with many friends. Teachers remembered her as someone who adapted well socially and academically, possessing the kind of natural charisma that made her well-liked by peers and adults alike. She graduated in 1978 with dreams of building a career in the travel industry. After completing her college education, Farah pursued her interest in airline ticketing by working with a travel agency in Croydon for a year. Her employers and coworkers loved her combination of professionalism and warmth, qualities that made her successful in customer service roles. She had a genuine gift for making people feel comfortable and valued. During this period in England, Farah was engaged to a local man who seemed like a suitable match for someone with her traditional values and family orientation. Her parents approved of the relationship, and Farah appeared to be following the path toward a conventional, stable life that many young women of her generation chose. However, Farah possessed an adventurous spirit that wouldn't be contained by the predictable life that awaited her in England. She dreamed of seeing the world and experiencing different cultures, dreams that would eventually lead her to make a decision that changed everything. When an opportunity arose to move to the United States and work for a major American airline, Farah saw it as the adventure she had been waiting for. Her family supported her decision, though they worried about their daughter living so far from the safety net they had always provided. Farah's move to Houston, Texas, in the early 1980s represented more than just a career change. It was a complete transformation of her life circumstances. She went from being surrounded by family and childhood friends to being alone in a foreign country where she had to rebuild her social network from scratch. The transition was both exciting and challenging. American culture was different from what Farah had known in England, and she had to learn to navigate not just a new job but an entirely new way of life. Her natural warmth and genuine interest in people helped her make friends quickly, though she remained somewhat naive about the dangers that could lurk behind friendly facades. Working at American Airlines put Farah in contact with hundreds of people every day, from travelers to coworkers to other airline industry professionals. She enjoyed the variety and energy of airport life, and her supervisors quickly recognized her as someone who could handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism. What Farah didn't realize as she settled into her new American life was that her kindness, her slight accent, and her trusting nature made her an ideal target for someone who specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerable people. Soon, she would encounter a charming American man who would seem like the perfect guide to her new country, but whose attention would come at a price she could never have imagined. The American Airlines employee cafeteria at Houston Intercontinental Airport buzzed with its usual mixture of tired travelers and airline staff grabbing quick meals between shifts. It was here, sometime in 1982, that Farah Bakr first encountered Robert Frada, though she had no way of knowing that this meeting would ultimately cost her life. Robert had been working as a ticket agent himself, a job that required the same customer service skills that made Farah so effective in her role. To observers, they seemed like a natural match, two attractive, professionally successful people who shared similar work environments and understood the demands of airline industry employment. Farah's coworker and close friend, Kitty Sneed, recalled that Robert and Farah just hit it off during their initial encounters. Robert possessed exactly the kind of confidence and charm that could sweep a young woman off her feet, especially someone who was still adjusting to life in a new country and looking for meaningful connections. What impressed Farah most about Robert was his apparent stability and success. He wore a uniform, carried himself with authority, and seemed to have his life perfectly organized. For someone who was still building her identity in America, Robert represented the kind of established American man who could provide security and guidance. Robert's approach to courtship was methodical and overwhelming. He showered Farah with attention, making her feel like the most important person in any room. Kitty Sneed remembered that Robert could charm the pants off anybody, a talent he deployed with devastating effectiveness on the trusting young woman from England. The cultural differences between Robert and Farah initially seemed charming rather than problematic. Robert was fascinated by Farah's accent and her stories about life in England, while Farah was impressed by Robert's knowledge of American customs and his apparent worldliness. Neither understood how these differences would later become sources of conflict and control. Robert's timing was perfect from his perspective. Farah was emotionally available, having recently ended her engagement to her boyfriend in England. She was also professionally established enough to be financially attractive, while remaining personally vulnerable enough to be manipulated. For Robert, who had been studying women's behavior for years, Farah represented an ideal target. Their courtship progressed quickly, with Robert using his knowledge of Farah's loneliness and desire for acceptance to accelerate their relationship. He made himself indispensable to her daily life, offering help with everything from navigating American bureaucracy to understanding local customs. This assistance came with subtle strings attached that Farah didn't recognize at the time. Despite warnings from some of her coworkers who sensed something troubling about Robert's intensity, Farah found herself drawn deeper into a relationship that seemed to offer everything she had been missing since leaving England. Robert's own motivation for pursuing Farah was complex. He was genuinely attracted to her beauty and impressed by her professional competence, but he was also calculating about her potential value as a wife. Farah's foreign background made her somewhat isolated from local support networks, and her trusting nature suggested she might be more willing to tolerate behavior that American women might quickly reject. The engagement came after a whirlwind courtship that left Farah's family in England concerned about the speed of developments. They had never met Robert and knew little about him beyond what Farah shared in her increasingly infrequent letters home. Their concerns were dismissed by Farah as natural parental worry about their daughter's life in a foreign country. By 1983, Robert had successfully convinced Farah to marry him, completing the first phase of what would become a decade-long campaign of psychological manipulation and abuse. Their wedding represented what Farah believed was the beginning of her American dream. But for Robert, it marked the successful acquisition of someone who would serve his needs while maintaining his respectable public image. Neither could predict how this union would ultimately destroy both their lives and devastate everyone around them. Robert and Farah Frada's marriage in 1983 began with the same promise that had characterized their courtship: the appearance of a perfect union between two successful, attractive people building a life together in suburban Houston. Their wedding photos show a radiant bride and confident groom who seemed to have everything necessary for lasting happiness. The early years brought the arrival of 3 children who would become the innocent victims of their father's eventual crimes. Bradley was born first in 1987, followed by Daniel in 1988, and finally Amber in 1990. Each birth seemed to strengthen the family unit and provide Farah with the maternal fulfillment she had always desired. Robert initially appeared to embrace fatherhood, posting photos of himself with his children and talking proudly about his growing family to coworkers and friends. The image he projected was that of a devoted husband and father who had successfully balanced his demanding career with family responsibilities. This public persona helped mask the disturbing changes occurring behind closed doors. Farah's letters to her family in England during this period reflect the mixed emotions of a woman trying to reconcile her growing concerns with her hopes for her marriage. She wrote enthusiastically about the children's development and achievements, while mentioning only in passing some of Robert's behavior that troubled her. The family's financial situation appeared stable during these early years. Robert's job with the Missouri City Public Safety Department provided steady income and benefits, while Farah continued working at American Airlines until the demands of caring for 3 young children made her employment impractical. Their suburban home in Atascocita represented the kind of American middle-class success that Farah had dreamed about when leaving England. However, those closest to Farah began noticing subtle changes in her demeanor as the 1980s progressed into the 1990s. Her natural vivacity seemed diminished, and she became increasingly reluctant to discuss her home life in detail. Friends attributed these changes to the normal stresses of raising 3 children while adjusting to reduced household income. Robert's behavior during this period reflected his growing confidence in his ability to control his domestic environment. His demands on Farah became more specific and more disturbing, though she kept these developments private out of shame and hope that things would improve once the children were older and family stress decreased. Robert's professional life during this period remained successful on the surface. His supervisors considered him a competent officer, though some colleagues noticed his tendency to boast about his dominance over his wife and his detailed descriptions of their intimate life. These conversations made listeners uncomfortable, but weren't considered serious enough to warrant official attention. By the early 1990s, the foundation of the Fratta marriage had begun to crack under the weight of Robert's increasing demands and Farah's growing resistance to his control. The three children, now old enough to sense the tension between their parents, began showing signs of stress that would later be recognized as indicators of domestic abuse in the household. What appeared to be a successful middle-class family was actually a carefully constructed facade hiding a pattern of abuse that was escalating toward violence. Farah's isolation from her family in England and her financial dependence on Robert made it difficult for her to seek help, while Robert's position as a law enforcement officer gave him additional leverage over any attempts she might make to expose his behavior. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would ultimately tear the family apart and lead Robert to seek accomplices who could help him maintain control through violence. The transformation of the Fratta household from the appearance of domestic bliss to a nightmare of psychological and sexual abuse occurred gradually, making it difficult for Farah to recognize when normal marital adjustments crossed the line into criminal behavior. What began as Robert's preferences in their intimate relationship evolved into demands that left Farah feeling degraded and trapped. Robert's sexual requirements included acts that Farah found physically repulsive and emotionally devastating. The clinical term coprophilia, a sexual obsession involving human waste, appeared in court documents, representing behavior so disturbing that even experienced family court judges were shocked. These weren't occasional requests, but systematic demands that Robert used to humiliate and control his wife. He convinced Farah that her disgust at these acts was a personal failing rather than a normal human response to degrading treatment. This psychological manipulation was designed to break down her self-respect and make her completely dependent on his approval. The psychological manipulation extended beyond sexual coercion. Robert controlled family finances, monitored Farah's activities, and gradually isolated her from potential sources of support. Her reduced contact with coworkers after leaving American Airlines meant fewer opportunities for outside perspective on her deteriorating situation. Robert's law enforcement background gave him particular advantages in maintaining control over his household. He understood how domestic abuse investigations worked and took care to avoid leaving evidence that might trigger official intervention. His knowledge of police procedures also meant he could anticipate and counter most strategies Farah might use to seek help. The children's presence complicated Farah's situation in multiple ways. As a devoted mother, she was reluctant to take any action that might separate her from Bradley, Daniel, and Amber. But she was also increasingly concerned about exposing them to their father's behavior. Robert exploited this maternal devotion by making it clear that any attempt to leave would result in a custody battle she was unlikely to win. Farah's cultural background created additional barriers to seeking help. Having grown up in a more traditional society, where marriage was considered permanent and private matters were kept within families, she lacked the cultural framework for understanding available resources or acceptable responses to domestic abuse. By 1991, Robert's demands had begun affecting Farah's physical appearance and emotional state in ways that concerned her remaining friends. Her decision to undergo cosmetic surgery was directly related to Robert's criticism of her body and his threats to seek satisfaction elsewhere if she didn't maintain his standards of attractiveness. Robert's pattern of behavior included periods of apparent normalcy that gave Farah hope for improvement, while making it difficult for her to maintain consistent resolve to seek help. These cycles of abuse followed by temporary reform are typical in domestic violence situations, but particularly effective when the abuser has professional training in manipulation techniques. The breaking point came when Robert's demands began extending beyond Farah herself toward their children. Her growing fear that Robert might begin victimizing Bradley, Daniel, or Amber gave her the motivation to overcome years of psychological conditioning and take action to protect them, even if it meant risking everything she had built in America. March 1992 marked the beginning of the end for both Robert and Farah Fratta, though neither fully understood the forces they were unleashing when Farah filed for divorce. Her decision represented more than just the dissolution of a marriage. It was a declaration of war against someone who had never accepted defeat in any aspect of his life. The divorce papers Farah submitted to Harris County Family Court contained accusations that shocked even experienced family law attorneys. The graphic details of Robert's sexual demands and abusive behavior provided a level of documentation rarely seen in divorce proceedings. But Farah understood that half measures would be inadequate against someone with Robert's resources and determination. Robert's reaction to the divorce filing revealed the extent of his psychological instability. Rather than attempting reconciliation or accepting responsibility for the breakdown of their marriage, he immediately began planning strategies to punish Farah for her perceived betrayal. His conversations with friends and coworkers shifted from complaints about marriage problems to explicit threats of violence. The custody battle that followed became the central focus of both parents' lives. Farah was fighting to protect her children from exposure to their father's disturbing behavior, while Robert was determined to maintain control over the family he considered his property. The stakes couldn't have been higher for either parent. Robert's law enforcement background initially gave him advantages in the custody proceedings. Family court judges often favored police officers in custody disputes, assuming that someone sworn to protect and serve would naturally be a good parent. Robert exploited this bias while carefully concealing the behavior that had driven Farah to seek divorce. As the legal proceedings continued through 1992 and 1993, Robert's public mask began slipping in ways that concerned his colleagues. His complaints about his wife became increasingly vitriolic, and his casual references to violence grew more frequent and specific. Several coworkers later testified that Robert had asked them directly about hiring someone to kill Farah. The financial aspects of the divorce presented another source of conflict. Robert faced the prospect of paying substantial child support and alimony while losing control over family assets he considered his exclusive domain. For someone with his need for dominance and control, the idea of being ordered to support his former wife was unbearable. Farah's deposition testimony, given in 1994, would later be recognized as one of the most courageous acts in the entire case. Despite knowing that Robert would learn the specific details of her accusations, she provided explicit testimony about his sexual demands and abusive behavior, creating a permanent legal record that could be used to protect their children. The judge presiding over the divorce proceedings later stated that Farah's testimony described the most depraved behavior he had encountered in his career. This judicial acknowledgement validated Farah's decision to document Robert's abuse, but it also sealed her fate by making it impossible for Robert to maintain his public image if the proceedings became public. By late 1994, the divorce case was nearing resolution, with indications that Farah would receive primary custody of the children and substantial financial support. This outcome represented everything Robert had been fighting to prevent and confirmed his worst fears about losing control over his family. The final court date was scheduled for late November 1994, just weeks after what would become the last day of Farah's life. She had won the legal battle and secured her children's future, but her victory came at a price that Robert was determined to collect through violence. Robert's transformation from abusive husband to murderous conspirator was complete by November 1994. He had identified accomplices, obtained weapons, and developed a plan that he believed would allow him to eliminate Farah while maintaining his alibi. His search for help with this deadly plan would soon bring him into contact with men who shared his willingness to use violence for personal gain. Joseph Andrew Pristash entered the world on September 5, 1956, in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were limited and shortcuts seemed appealing. Unlike Robert Frada's relatively stable upbringing, Joseph's early years were marked by the kind of struggles that often led young men down dangerous paths. Joseph's criminal history began with minor offenses, petty theft, small-time drug dealings, and other crimes that reflected his willingness to take risks for quick money. He served time in local jails and developed the kind of prison connections that would prove significant years later. When Joseph was released from his most recent incarceration in the early 1990s, he was approaching 40 and looking for ways to rebuild his life. He found work where he could and tried to maintain the appearance of going straight, but the lure of easy money remained strong. Joseph had one asset that made him valuable to certain people. He was reliable. When someone needed something done without questions asked, Joseph could be counted on to deliver. He understood the unspoken rules of criminal partnerships and knew how to keep his mouth shut when necessary. The gym culture of the early 1990s in Houston provided Joseph with opportunities to meet people from different walks of life. He wasn't particularly focused on fitness, but gyms were places where deals were made and connections formed. It was during this period that Joseph first encountered Robert Frada. Robert and Joseph might have seemed like an unlikely pair, the clean-cut police officer and the ex-convict, but they shared certain qualities that drew them together. Both men believed in taking what they wanted rather than earning it through honest work. Both had a casual disregard for the rights of others. Joseph became a regular part of Robert's gym circle, listening to the police officer's increasingly frequent complaints about his marriage and his growing hatred for his wife. What started as typical divorced man's griping gradually escalated into something much more dangerous. Unlike others in their social circle who dismissed Robert's violent talk as harmless venting, Joseph paid careful attention. He recognized an opportunity when he heard one, and Robert Frada was presenting him with the biggest opportunity of his life. As Robert's complaints about his wife became more specific and his requests for help became more direct, Joseph realized he was being recruited for something that would either make him rich or get him killed. The choice he was about to make would determine not only his own fate, but the lives of everyone around him. By the fall of 1994, Joseph had agreed to help Robert solve his wife problem in exchange for substantial payment and other considerations. The next step was finding someone willing to actually pull the trigger, someone young and desperate enough to commit murder for money. Joseph knew exactly where to find such a person, living right next door to him. This recruitment would bring an 18-year-old into the conspiracy and set in motion the events that would destroy multiple lives. Howard Paul Guidry was born on April 15, 1976, into circumstances that offered few paths toward legitimate success. At 18 years old in 1994, Howard was exactly the kind of young man who attracted the attention of people like Joseph Pristash. He was desperate for money, willing to take risks, and naive enough to believe he could handle whatever came his way. These qualities would soon make him the most dangerous person in this story. Howard's childhood had been marked by instability and neglect. Without strong parental guidance or positive role models, he gravitated toward older men who seemed to have money and respect in the neighborhood. Joseph Pristash was one of these figures, a man who always seemed to have cash and connections. Living next door to Pristash gave Howard a front-row seat to a lifestyle that seemed glamorous compared to his own struggles. He watched as Joseph entertained visitors, made mysterious phone calls, and came and went at odd hours with pockets full of money. For a teenager with limited options, this world looked appealing. Howard's relationship with Joseph began casually. The older man would occasionally hire him for small jobs, moving boxes, cleaning up around the property, or running errands that Joseph preferred not to handle himself. These tasks paid better than anything Howard could find through legitimate channels. As Howard proved his reliability and discretion, Joseph began trusting him with more significant responsibilities. Nothing illegal at first, but the work gradually pushed the boundaries of what most people would consider acceptable. Howard was being groomed without realizing it. The teenager's desperation made him the perfect recruit. He had bills to pay, no legitimate prospects for advancement, and a growing sense that society had written him off before giving him a real chance. When Joseph began hinting about bigger opportunities that could solve all of Howard's financial problems, the young man was ready to listen. Howard had one crucial qualification for what Joseph had in mind. He had never killed anyone, which meant he lacked the psychological barriers that might prevent someone from crossing that line. His youth also meant he might receive a lighter sentence if caught, making him less of a liability than an older, more experienced criminal. The weapon that would soon be the center of a murder case was already in Joseph's possession. Though Howard didn't know its history or significance. Joseph had obtained the gun through his relationship with Robert Fratta, though the exact details of this transaction would later become a key piece of evidence. As November 1994 approached, Howard found himself drawn deeper into discussions about a job that would pay more money than he had ever seen. Joseph was careful not to reveal too many details at once, but he made it clear that this opportunity could change Howard's life forever. What Howard didn't understand was that he was being positioned as the expendable member of a conspiracy that had been months in the planning. While Robert Fratta would maintain his alibi and Joseph would stay safely in the background, Howard would be the one holding the gun when everything went wrong. But before the main attack that would take Farah's life in November 1994, another violent assault occurred in her home that would prove to be a chilling preview of Robert's willingness to use extreme measures to control his estranged wife. By mid-1994, Robert was losing ground in the divorce proceedings. Farah's brave testimony about his sexual demands and abusive behavior was being taken seriously by the family court judge, and Robert faced the prospect of losing custody of his children while being ordered to pay substantial alimony and child support. For a man who had controlled every aspect of his marriage through intimidation, this legal defeat was unbearable. Robert's response was to escalate to physical terror. If he couldn't win in court, he would frighten Farah into submission through violence. Before we go into more extreme details about this case, take a moment to support this channel. Hit the like button if you believe stories like this should be told in full, not just headlines, but every twist, every detail. And subscribe to No Way Out, where we break down true crime cases into pieces you can follow clearly, so you can make your own conclusions about guilt, justice, and redemption. Now, back to the case. On a quiet evening in mid-1994, while her 3 young children slept in their bedrooms, Farah awoke to find a masked man standing over her bed. The intruder had somehow entered her home without triggering alarms or waking the children, suggesting inside knowledge of the house layout and security system. The masked attacker carried a stun gun, a weapon specifically chosen to inflict maximum pain and terror without leaving visible marks that might prompt a serious police investigation. This wasn't a random home invasion or robbery. Nothing was taken from the house, and the intruder's sole focus was terrorizing Farah herself. The attack itself was brief but devastating. The masked man used the stun gun on Farah multiple times, causing intense pain while making it clear that he could have done much worse. The message was unmistakable. This was a warning about what could happen if she continued with the divorce proceedings. After the attack, the intruder fled without taking anything of value, confirming that this was not a random burglary or typical home invasion. The lack of theft and the specific targeting of Farah made it clear that someone with personal knowledge of the family had orchestrated the incident. Detective Larry Davis responded to Farah's 911 call and immediately recognized that this was not a random crime. She was upset. Farah's suspicions about the attack focused immediately on her estranged husband. She told Detective Davis that she believed Robert had arranged the incident as intimidation, though she had no direct evidence to support her theory. Davis, drawing on his experience with domestic violence cases, shared her suspicions but lacked probable cause for an arrest. The detective's response to Farah's suspicions included a direct warning to Robert. The stun gun attack had exactly the effect Robert intended. Farah became increasingly fearful and began asking friends whether they thought Robert would actually have her killed. Her question to Kitty Sneed, "Do you think Bob would ever have me murdered?" showed that she understood the escalating danger but felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The failure of the stun gun attack to achieve Robert's primary goal, stopping the divorce proceedings, meant that he would need to consider more drastic measures. Farah's continued pursuit of custody and support payments, despite the obvious threat, showed Robert that intimidation alone would not be sufficient to maintain control. The attack also demonstrated Robert's ability to recruit accomplices for criminal activity. While the identity of the masked intruder was never established, the incident proved that Robert had access to people willing to commit violent crimes on his behalf. This escalation proved that Robert would stop at nothing to maintain control, setting the stage for the final deadly act that was already being planned in gym conversations and criminal meetings across Houston. Wednesday, November 9th, 1994, began like any other day for the Fratta family, with no external signs of the tragedy that would unfold before midnight. Robert maintained his normal routine, reporting for his shift with the Missouri City Public Safety Department and interacting with colleagues as if nothing unusual was planned for that evening. Farah spent the day caring for their 3 children while making arrangements for what she believed would be a typical Wednesday night routine. Robert was scheduled to have his weekly supervised visitation with Bradley, Daniel, and Amber, a court-mandated arrangement that allowed him limited time with his children under controlled circumstances. The day's schedule had been carefully planned by Robert for months. Every element of what would happen that evening had been rehearsed and coordinated with his accomplices. The seemingly innocent family dinner and church visit were actually crucial components of an alibi designed to place him far from the scene during the murder. At approximately 6 p.m., Robert arrived to collect the children for their scheduled time together. His behavior appeared normal to observers, though Farah seemed more tense than usual during the brief interaction. She had no way of knowing that she was looking at her children's father for the last time. Robert drove the children to Wyatt's Cafeteria, a family restaurant, where they shared what would be their final meal together. During dinner, Robert appeared distracted and made several trips to use the restaurant's payphone. After dinner, Robert took the children to a Catholic church in Humble, Texas, where he left the 2 younger children at the nursery and accompanied Bradley to his catechism class. Robert then joined a meeting for parents whose children were preparing for First Communion, establishing his presence with multiple witnesses during the crucial time period. However, Robert's behavior at the church struck several witnesses as unusual. He appeared tense and distracted, repeatedly leaving the meeting to make and receive phone calls in the parish office. These interruptions were so frequent that other parents began to notice and comment on his strange demeanor. While Robert was establishing his alibi at the church, Farah was maintaining her normal evening routine. She decided to get her hair cut before Robert returned with the children, a decision that unknowingly put her on a collision course with the conspiracy that had been planned for months. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Farah left the beauty salon, where she'd been getting her hair styled. She drove directly home to her house on Forest Fern Drive in Atascocita, arriving just as the sun was setting. Her neighbor across the street, Laura Holscher, was nursing her infant son when she noticed Farah's car pulling into the driveway. Howard Guidry had been waiting in the backyard playhouse for hours, armed with the .38 caliber revolver that Robert had provided through Joseph Pristash. The teenager was nervous about his first murder, but motivated by the promise of $1,000 payment and convinced by his older accomplices that the job would be simple and risk-free. As Farah reversed her car into the garage, She had no way of knowing that her movements were being watched by someone prepared to kill her. The garage door began closing behind her car, creating the enclosed space where Howard had been instructed to carry out the shooting. At exactly 7:38 p.m., Laura Holscher heard the first gunshot. She looked across the street just in time to see Farah fall beside her vehicle in the garage. Moments later, a second shot echoed through the neighborhood, ensuring that there would be no chance of survival or identification of the shooter. Howard Guidry emerged from the garage and ran toward the street where Joseph Pristash waited in his silver Nissan with one burned-out headlight. The getaway car's distinctive appearance would become crucial evidence as multiple witnesses noticed the vehicle and its occupants fleeing the scene. Laura Holscher immediately called 911, providing a real-time account of the shooting and escape that would become the foundation of the police investigation. Her detailed descriptions of the shooter and getaway vehicle gave investigators their first leads in what would become a complex conspiracy case. The 911 call from Laura Holscher brought Harris County Sheriff's deputies racing to Forest Fern Drive within minutes of the shooting. What they found was a crime scene that immediately suggested something more complex than a random robbery or typical domestic dispute gone wrong. Farah Fratta lay dying in her garage, having sustained 2 gunshot wounds to the head from close range. The precision of the shots and the location of the wounds indicated an execution-style killing rather than the chaotic violence typical of crimes of passion or robbery attempts. Detective Larry Davis arrived at the scene and immediately recognized both the victim and the significance of her identity. His previous encounters with the Fratta family, particularly the unsolved stun gun attack months earlier, made it clear that this murder was the culmination of an escalating pattern of domestic violence. The physical evidence at the scene provided crucial information about the shooter and the method of attack. 2 bullet fragments were recovered from the garage, along with evidence that the killer had waited in the backyard before confronting Farah as she returned home. The lack of defensive wounds suggested that the attack had been sudden and professionally executed. Robert Fratta's arrival at the crime scene, roughly 30 minutes after the shooting, raised immediate suspicions among the responding officers. His behavior was notably inappropriate for someone who had just learned of his wife's murder. Instead of showing shock or grief, Robert appeared composed and primarily concerned with managing the situation. Detective Davis's first words to Robert were significant. "Bob, I told you to leave her alone." Robert's response, "I didn't do anything," suggested consciousness of guilt rather than the confusion expected from an innocent person. This exchange established the foundation for treating Robert as the primary suspect. The interrogation of Robert Fratta that followed provided investigators with additional evidence of his involvement. His demeanor during questioning was described by detectives as inappropriately casual, and his explanations for his whereabouts during the murder seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. When detectives searched Robert's vehicle, they discovered over $1,000 in cash in the glove compartment, exactly the amount that would later be identified as payment to the hired killer. Robert's explanation for having this money was unconvincing and raised additional questions about his preparation for the evening's events. The witness statements collected by investigators painted a picture of a murder that had been carefully planned and professionally executed. Laura Holscher's detailed description of the shooter and gay vehicle provided crucial leads, while other neighbors confirmed the timing and sequence of events. The church alibi that Robert had carefully constructed actually provided investigators with additional evidence against him. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Robert had been at the church during the murder, but they also documented his unusual behavior and frequent phone calls during the time period when the shooting occurred. Phone records subpoenaed by investigators revealed a pattern of communications between Robert and unknown parties in the hours leading up to the murder. These calls, made to numbers associated with Mary Gipp and her associates, would eventually provide the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The investigation's early focus on Robert Fratta was based on solid evidence and experience with domestic violence cases. Detective Davis and his colleagues understood that the vast majority of women are killed by intimate partners, and Robert's history of threats and abuse made him the logical primary suspect. However, proving Robert's involvement would require investigators to uncover the network of accomplices he had used to carry out the murder while maintaining his alibi. This challenge would take months to resolve and would ultimately depend on the cooperation of witnesses who initially had no intention of helping police solve the case. The break that investigators had been waiting for came in March 1995, 4 months after Farah's murder, through circumstances that had nothing to do with their investigation. Howard Guidry's arrest for an unrelated bank robbery would provide the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy and brought justice for Farah Fratta. On March 1, 1995, Howard Guidry attempted to rob a Houston area bank, a crime that suggested his desperation for money had not been satisfied by the payment he received for murdering Farah. The bank robbery was poorly planned and quickly failed, leading to Guidry's arrest and a search of his belongings. When police searched Guidry's backpack after his arrest, they discovered a .38 caliber Charter Arms revolver that would prove to be the most important piece of evidence in the Farah Fratta murder case. The weapon was immediately sent for ballistics testing to determine if it might be connected to any unsolved crimes. The ballistics analysis confirmed that bullet fragments recovered from Farah's garage had been fired from the revolver found in Guidry's possession. This connection linked the teenage bank robber to the Atascocita murder, though investigators still needed to understand how these crimes were related. The crucial breakthrough came when Mary Gipp, Joseph Pristash's girlfriend, she contacted the Harris County Sheriff's Department a few days after Guidry's arrest. Gipp had been carrying the secret of the murder conspiracy for months, and Guidry's arrest made her realize that the entire plot was about to unravel. Mary Gipp's decision to cooperate with investigators was motivated by self-preservation rather than conscience. She understood that her knowledge of the murder plot made her a potential suspect, and she hoped that providing information about the conspiracy would protect her from prosecution. Gipp's initial statements to investigators provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. She revealed that Robert Fratta had hired her boyfriend Joseph Pristash to arrange Farah's murder, and that Pristash had in turn recruited their neighbor, Howard Guidry, to serve as the gunman. The information Gipp provided included details about the murder plot that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. She described the planning meetings, the payment arrangements, and the specific roles played by each conspirator. Most importantly, she had documented the serial number of the murder weapon. Investigators quickly traced the revolver's registration and discovered that it had been purchased by Robert Fratta in 1982. This connection provided the direct link between Robert and the murder weapon that had been missing from their case. But the gun's history revealed an even more troubling story. During the divorce proceedings in 1993, as tensions in the Fratta household escalated, Farah had become increasingly concerned about Robert's access to weapons while living in the same house as their 3 young children. Fearing for her family's safety, she had convinced Robert to let her father, Lex Baker, who has since moved to the United States, to keep the .38 caliber revolver for safekeeping at his home. For months, the weapon remained securely stored at the Baker residence, representing one small measure of protection Farah had managed to secure for her children. However, in the summer of 1994, as Robert's desperation about the divorce outcome intensified, he demanded the return of his registered firearm. Lex Baker, who had no legal grounds to refuse returning Robert's legally owned weapon, reluctantly gave the gun back to his son-in-law, despite his growing concerns about Robert's mental state and escalating threats toward Farah. The timing of this retrieval, just months before Farah's murder, would later prove to be devastatingly significant. When detectives showed Lex the murder weapon after Howard Guidry's arrest, the grieving father immediately recognized it as the same revolver he had kept for safekeeping and returned to Robert. This identification provided investigators with irrefutable evidence linking Robert directly to the weapon that had killed his daughter. The arrest warrants for Robert Frada and Joseph Pristash were issued within days of receiving Gipp's statement. Both men were taken into custody and charged with capital murder, crimes that carried the possibility of death sentences under Texas law. Robert's arrest marked the end of his confidence that he had committed the perfect crime. His carefully constructed alibi and his use of intermediaries to carry out the murder had not protected him from investigation once the conspiracy began to unravel. Joseph Pristash's arrest confirmed investigators' theory about the murder being a conspiracy involving multiple participants. Pristash's role as middleman had been crucial to Robert's plan, but it also made him vulnerable once Mary Gipp decided to cooperate with police. The confessions that both Guidry and Pristash eventually provided gave investigators detailed accounts of how the murder conspiracy had been organized and executed. These statements confirmed Mary Gipp's version of events and provided additional evidence against Robert Frada. The prosecution of Robert Frada, Joseph Pristash, and Howard Guidry for the murder of Farah Frada would become one of the most significant capital murder cases in Harris County history. All three defendants faced potential death sentences under Texas law, which treats all participants in a murder-for-hire conspiracy as equally culpable, regardless of their specific roles. Robert Frada was the first to stand trial, beginning on April 9, 1996. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler built her case around the extensive evidence of Robert's threats against Farah, his connection to the murder weapon, and his coordination of the conspiracy through phone calls made during his supposed alibi at the church. The prosecution's strategy focused on presenting Robert as a manipulative narcissist who had orchestrated his wife's murder to avoid paying child support and to prevent the public disclosure of his sexually deviant behavior. Siegler argued that Robert's position as a police officer had given him both the means and the confidence to believe he could commit the perfect crime. The most dramatic moment of Robert's trial came when his 7-year-old son Bradley testified about his father's behavior on the night of the murder. Against the advice of her supervisors, Siegler made the controversial decision to put the child on the witness stand, where his testimony about Robert's phone calls at the church provided crucial evidence of the conspiracy. The jury in Robert's trial took less than an hour to convict him of capital murder on April 18, 1996. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming evidence against him and their conclusion that his guilt had been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. During the sentencing phase of Robert's trial, Farah's mother, Betty Bacher, delivered a victim impact statement that captured the devastation caused by Robert's actions. She called her former son-in-law a monster for destroying their family and leaving 3 children without their mother. On April 24, 1996, the jury unanimously sentenced Robert to death. Joseph Pristash's trial began on July 1, 1996, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty despite his role as middleman rather than triggerman. The prosecution argued that Pristash's willingness to recruit a teenager for murder demonstrated his complete disregard for human life and made him deserving of the ultimate punishment. The jury in Pristash's case deliberated for only 17 minutes before convicting him of capital murder on July 8, 1996. Their quick decision reflected the strength of the evidence against him and their conclusion that his role in the conspiracy warranted the death penalty. Pristash was formally sentenced to death on August 2, 1996. Howard Guidry's trial, which began on March 20, 1997, presented prosecutors with the challenge of seeking the death penalty against someone who had been 18 years old at the time of the murder. The prosecution argued that Guidry's youth did not excuse his willingness to commit murder for money, and that his actions demonstrated a level of callousness that justified capital punishment. The defense strategy for Guidry focused on his age and the influence of older conspirators who had manipulated him into participating in the murder. Defense attorneys argued that a life sentence would be more appropriate than execution for someone who had been a teenager when recruited for the crime. The jury in Guidry's case initially deadlocked on the sentence, reflecting their struggle with executing someone who had been so young at the time of the murder. After 2 days of deliberation, they ultimately recommended the death penalty on March 27, 1997, and Guidry was formally sentenced to death on April 16, 1997. The 3 death sentences represented an unusual outcome in capital murder cases. Legal experts noted that it was extremely rare for all participants in a murder-for-hire conspiracy to receive death sentences, particularly when one of them was a teenager at the time of the crime. The success of the prosecutions reflected the strength of the evidence gathered by investigators and the skill of the prosecutors in presenting complex conspiracy charges to juries. The cases also demonstrated the serious view that Texas courts took of domestic violence murders and murder-for-hire schemes. The death sentences provided some measure of satisfaction to Farah's family and friends, who had watched her suffer through years of abuse before her ultimate murder. However, the legal process was far from over, as all 3 defendants had the right to appeal their convictions and sentences through both state and federal courts. The Frada case would eventually become a textbook example of how murder-for-hire conspiracies could be successfully prosecuted even when the mastermind maintained an alibi and used intermediaries to carry out the actual killing. The thorough investigation and skilled prosecution had ensured that all 3 participants would face the ultimate penalty for their roles in Farah's death. However, the appeals process that followed would take decades and raise fundamental questions about constitutional rights and prosecutorial conduct. The death sentences imposed on Robert Frada, Joseph Pristash, and Howard Guidry marked the beginning of a lengthy appeals process that would span more than 2 decades and raise fundamental questions about constitutional rights, prosecutorial conduct, and the administration of capital punishment in Texas. Robert Frada's first major victory came in October 2007, when U.S. District Judge Melinda Harmon overturned his conviction after finding that the prosecution's case had relied heavily on confessions from Pristash and Guidry that were obtained in violation of his Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses. Harmon's ruling criticized the trial procedure and conduct of both prosecutors and police investigators. Judge Harmon's decision was particularly scathing in its assessment of the prosecution's tactics. She wrote that trial evidence showed Frada to be egotistical, misogynistic, and vile, with a callous desire to kill his wife, but concluded that these character flaws did not justify violating his constitutional rights during the legal proceedings. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Harmon's ruling on July 22, 2008, confirming that Robert's right to confront the witnesses against him had been violated when prosecutors used the confessions of co-conspirators who did not testify at trial. This decision meant that Robert would receive a new trial after more than a decade on death row. Howard Guidry also received a new trial in 2005 after a federal court found that his confession had been illegally coerced and that prosecutors had misused hearsay evidence during his original trial. The ruling reflected growing scrutiny of police interrogation techniques and prosecutorial conduct in capital cases. The retrials of both Robert Frada and Howard Guidry would take place without the crucial confession evidence that had helped convict them originally. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving their cases using only physical evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial proof of the conspiracy. Guidry's retrial began on February 19, 2007, with many of the same witnesses returning to testify about their knowledge of the murder plot. Mary Gipp again provided crucial testimony about the conspiracy, while Farah's father testified about the murder weapon that had belonged to Robert Frada. The jury in Guidry's retrial convicted him of capital murder on February 23, 2007, and sentenced him to death on March 1, 2007. The speed of their decision suggested that the evidence against Guidry remained compelling even without his confession, and their willingness to impose the death penalty again confirmed their view of his culpability. Robert Frada's retrial began on May 5, 2009, under the supervision of District Judge Belinda Hill. The prosecution faced the additional challenge of proceeding without the confessions of either Pristash or Guidry, both of whom had invoked their Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify against their former co-conspirator. The most dramatic elements of Robert's retrial were the testimonies of his 3 children, all of whom had changed their surnames to Bakr and now testified against their father. Bradley, Daniel, and Amber, now young adults, provided heartbreaking accounts of how their mother's murder had affected their lives and their relationships with the man who had ordered her killing. Bradley Bakr, now 22 years old, had spent most of his life trying to understand how his father could have orchestrated his mother's murder. His testimony as an adult carried weight that his childhood statements could never have possessed, and his detailed memories of that terrible night provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. During his testimony, Bradley described his father's unusual behavior at the church on November 9, 1994. He remembered Robert making multiple phone calls during what should have been a quiet evening of religious instruction, and he recalled feeling confused by his father's obvious distraction and nervousness. He told us to wait in the car while he made a phone call, Bradley testified, providing the jury with direct evidence of Robert's coordination with his accomplices during the murder. The phone records that prosecutors presented showed these calls were made to numbers associated with Mary Gipp and the conspiracy network. Daniel Bakr, now 21, provided testimony about the long-term impact of losing his mother and living with the knowledge that his father had been responsible. "There's been times I wish I had my mom," Daniel told the jury. "I wish I had a dad too." His words captured the complete devastation that Robert's actions had caused to his own family. Daniel's testimony also revealed the ongoing psychological damage caused by Robert's crime. He admitted to having anger issues throughout his life and acknowledged that his problems stemmed from his father's actions. "I was always upset. I would see kids with their dads or their mothers. I was always jealous, always mad," he explained. Amber Bakr, the youngest of the 3 children, had been only 4 years old when her mother was murdered. Now 19, she confronted her father in court for the first time since childhood, describing her attempt to visit him in prison and his complete lack of remorse or acknowledgement of responsibility. "I was hoping for him to fess up, but I knew it wouldn't happen," Amber testified. "It was frustrating. Seeing his daughter break down and cry, I thought he would have some sort of emotion. He didn't. It was really frustrating." Her words revealed Robert's continued callousness even when faced with his daughter's pain. The children's testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated the ongoing consequences of Robert's actions. These were not abstract victims, but real people whose lives had been permanently damaged by their father's decision to murder their mother, rather than accept the consequences of divorce. Prosecutor Kelly Siegler had made a controversial decision to use child testimony in the original trial, but the adult testimony in the retrial carried even greater impact. The jury could see the mature, thoughtful individuals that Bradley, Daniel, and Amber had become despite their traumatic childhood. The fact that all 3 children had changed their surnames to Bakr, their maternal grandparents' name, sent a clear message about their feelings toward their father. They had rejected not just Robert personally, but even the family name that connected them to him. The children's testimony also provided insight into Robert's character that went beyond his crimes. Their descriptions of his behavior during supervised visits and his continued attempts to manipulate them, even after his conviction, showed a pattern of selfishness and narcissism that had never changed. Social worker Judy Cox, who had supervised the children's visits with Robert after Farah's murder, testified about their obvious distress and confusion during those encounters. Her notes from those sessions provided additional evidence of Robert's inappropriate behavior and his children's instinctive fear of him. The jury in Robert's retrial convicted him of capital murder on May 14, 2009, and sentenced him to death on May 29, 2009. Joseph Pristash, who had not received a new trial, continued pursuing appeals through both state and federal courts. His lawyers argued that he had been prejudiced by the same prosecutorial misconduct that had led to the other defendants' retrials, but courts consistently rejected these arguments. By 2018, all three defendants had exhausted their direct appeals through state courts. Their cases then moved to federal court, where they would spend several more years challenging their convictions on constitutional grounds while remaining on death row, awaiting execution. The lengthy appeals process reflected both the complexity of the legal issues involved and the thoroughness of the review required in capital cases. While the delays frustrated Farah's family and friends, the multiple levels of review ensured that constitutional rights were protected and that the ultimate sentences were appropriate given the evidence and the law. However, time was running out for the three men who had conspired to murder Farah Frada, and their final reckonings were approaching. January 10, 2023, marked the end of Robert Frada's 27-year journey from murderer to executed criminal. The former Missouri City police officer who had believed he could commit the perfect crime would finally face the ultimate consequence for orchestrating his wife's death nearly 3 decades earlier. The path to Robert's execution had been complicated by years of appeals, retrials, and legal challenges, but the final outcome was never seriously in doubt. The evidence against him had remained overwhelming, despite the constitutional violations that had temporarily overturned his original conviction. Robert's final day was spent in the death house at the Huntsville unit, where Texas conducts all executions. He declined to make any final statements to the media and spent his time with a spiritual advisor who accompanied him to the execution chamber. The witnesses to Robert's execution included his eldest son Bradley Bakar and Farah's brother Zane Bakar, both of whom had waited decades to see justice finally served. Also present were victim advocate Andy Kahan, who had promised Farah's father Lex before his death that he would witness the execution on the family's behalf. When asked by the warden if he had any final words, Robert simply replied, "No." His refusal to make a statement was consistent with his decades-long refusal to accept responsibility for his actions or express remorse for the devastation he had caused. The execution process began at 7:25 p.m. when the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered through intravenous lines in both of Robert's arms. A spiritual advisor held his hand and prayed as the drug took effect, and Robert was pronounced dead at 7:49 p.m., 24 minutes after the injection began. Robert's death marked the first execution carried out in Texas in 2023, closing a chapter in one of the state's most notorious murder-for-hire cases. His execution was also notable for the presence of his adult son as a witness, a reminder of the ongoing impact of his crimes on his own family. Andy Kahan, speaking after the execution, described Robert as a coward in 1994 when he arranged the murder for hire of his estranged wife, and still a coward tonight when he was offered an opportunity to at least extend an olive branch to his son that he knew was watching. Robert's final silence confirmed that he had learned nothing from his decades on death row. The execution brought some measure of closure to Farah's family and friends, though it could never undo the damage caused by Robert's actions. The 3 children he had orphaned were now adults who had built lives despite their traumatic childhood. But they would always carry the burden of knowing their father had murdered their mother. Robert's execution also marked a significant moment in the broader Frata case, as he was the first of the 3 co-conspirators to face the ultimate penalty. Joseph Pristash and Howard Guidry remained on death row, their own executions delayed by ongoing appeals, but seemingly inevitable given the strength of the evidence against them. The case had taken nearly 30 years to reach its final resolution for Robert, demonstrating both the complexity of capital punishment procedures and the thoroughness of the appeals process designed to prevent wrongful executions. However, the ultimate outcome confirmed that the original jury's verdict had been correct, despite the procedural problems that had temporarily overturned his conviction. Robert Frada's execution served as a reminder that domestic violence can escalate to murder when batterers face the loss of control over their victims. His case had helped establish important legal precedents about murder-for-hire conspiracies and had demonstrated that even police officers are not above the law when they choose to commit murder. With Robert dead, attention turned to his surviving accomplices and the question of whether they would face similar fates. If you found this case as haunting as we did, don't let it fade into silence. Share this video so more people can understand the cost of obsession, control, and betrayal. Subscribe to No Way Out for more real cases broken down piece by piece so you can see the choices, the consequences, and the truth behind every headline. Real crimes, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Because sometimes the most ordinary faces hide the most dangerous secrets.